Welcome to Books of Kings. I'm Ian Hewitt, and I'm here with my co-host Caleb Kramer. And Caleb and I recently did an episode on everything pertaining to Solomon's Temple. That's episode 3 of our podcast, Books of Kings, the first narrative history podcast on the Bible. And since Caleb and I are both visual learners, is that fair to say?
Close enough.
We both spent some time looking at different artistic depictions of the temple and some different kind of 3D simulations based on the data in the Books of Kings. And we thought we'd go ahead and look today at some different artistic depictions of the temple and critique them. We'll tell you which are accurate and which are not so accurate. So Caleb, I thought we'd start by looking at a couple of images of the cherubim, because no one really knows what the cherubim look like. The Deuteronomist, that is the word for the author of the Books of Kings, simply assumes that the readers know what a cherub is. So he tells us that they have these massive wingspans, they're 15 feet tall, they fill the Holy of Holies, and they're covered with gold. But he doesn't then describe what the actual figures look like. So what some people have assumed is that the cherubim were the most common cherub figures in the ancient Near East. So these kind of winged quadrupeds we see in Assyrian and Babylonian art. That's this top image here. Caleb, what do you picture when you think of the term cherubim?
Well, I've been brought up in the church, and there's this kind of lingering image of these cute little humanoid creatures with tiny little wings, maybe just 2 sets, and then arms and legs. I think that's just kind of common in the culture. Maybe perhaps a little fiercer with a sword, hearkening back to Genesis, but generally humanoid with one head, one face, that type of thing.
Caleb, this top image is taken from a YouTube channel, Messages of Christ, I think. And in general, there's no doubt they did a very, very good job using the data in the Books of Kings and 1 Kings 6, especially this Holy of Holies is very accurate, I would say. We have the covered with gold in the interior. It looks like it's about 30 feet in any given direction. We have palm leaves. But a lot of people who commented on this image were very, very upset that you have these Egyptian-looking quadruped cherubs. And I assumed that people expected to see, like you said, ordinary humanoid, 2 wings, human faces. And I do have to say, whatever the cherubim look like, and I'm open to different possibilities, there's no reason to assume that they conform to this modern Western image of what an angel ought to have looked like. The cherubim could have looked like a variety of different ancient Near Eastern figures.
Right, that seems about right. And the imagery that we see in front of us, like I said, is very common in the Mideast, but I don't think that necessarily detracts from the likelihood of it. As we discussed in the previous episode, the overall arching design of the temple was Phoenician in its inspiration. I don't think that we have to assume that the aesthetics or the images are going to be sort of this whole cloth modern tradition that we've kind of projected backwards onto these accounts.
That's right. Everyone recognizes that the temple was Phoenician in design. Phoenician temples were these long rectangles with an entrance at one end. We know that Phoenicians were involved in building the temple. That's in the biblical account. So if that's not controversial, why would we simply assume there aren't going to be other ancient Near Eastern influences on, for example, what the cherubim looked like? Now, look, this bottom image, let's talk about this for a moment. This image is taken from Ezekiel chapter 1. And Ezekiel describes these living creatures which some people think are intended to parallel the cherubim in the temple. He never says these are the cherubim, and I'm talking about the temple cherubim, but he does describe these creatures with their wings touching the tip of the wings of another creature. He actually describes 4 of them, not 2. I misspoke on the episode when I said 2. But because the wings are described as touching each other, like the wings of the cherubim in the Holy of Holies, some people think, all right, well, Ezekiel was an eyewitness to the temple, and these are the cherubim. And he describes these 4-headed, 4-winged creatures. And so we have here a possibility of cherubim which are rather more unnerving looking, I would say, than the quadruped cherubim we have in the top image.
And actually, I find that a bit more plausible, simply because we have this eyewitness to the first temple, testifying as to not only his, the appearance of what he identifies as a cherubim, but I mean the implicit association is there, even if he doesn't explicitly say that these are the cherubim of the first temple. Plus, the imagery is consistent through a number of apocalyptic type visions that you see throughout the Bible. These multi-faced, multi-winged kind of, like you said, bizarre and unnerving creatures. I think that seems a little more to fit the aesthetic.
I do think it's a really good data point for this theory that Ezekiel was describing the temple cherubim, that he says the tips of the wings are touching. I feel like that certainly makes me immediately think of the description of the cherubim in 1 Kings 6, and anyone who was an eyewitness to the Holy of Holies, like Ezekiel was, presumably would have thought of that right away as well. This is another image of the cherubim. The cherubim here, I think, are a bit too short. These look like about 10 feet tall. Remember, the cherubim are supposed to be 15 feet tall. But there's some incorporation of some of the imagery from Ezekiel. So we see the two wings out in front and two upper wings reaching out side to side. Of course, the faces here are deliberately hidden or ambiguous.
Actually, it looks like there might be 6 wings. I think
there's 2 wings on the bottom.
2 wings on the bottom, yeah. Which actually it'd be more of a seraphim. But again,
that's right. The seraphim have 6 wings.
Right, exactly.
The cherubim have 4.
Yeah.
So
again, there's not a clear delineation. Even in Hebrew tradition, there's not a clear delineation in the imagery between cherubim and seraphim. They tend to have,
other than the wings.
Other than the wings, right? But almost all description of these angelic beings tend to have morphologically similar and then dissimilar things throughout time. There's no distinct categories that are hard and fast. I think people afterwards, and this is something that the early church fathers tried to do, is kind of create hard and fast categories, angelic hierarchies, if you will. That I don't think that those were in extent when the first temple and the Book of Kings even was written.
Right. I mean, certainly when Isaiah is talking about seraphim, I don't know if Isaiah had in mind this sort of hierarchical table of angelology.
Right.
There are different kinds of angelic beings, and Isaiah does seem conscious of that.
He does, but I think this kind of hard and fast hierarchical categories is definitely something that we've sort of had the benefit of tradition now, but now I think we read back into it a little more than is warranted.
Right, I agree. Caleb, one nice detail I like here that we don't see very often is you have the poles used to carry the Ark of the Covenant sticking just through the doorway. That's a nice, accurate detail that we have some testimony to that you don't see in many depictions of the Holy of Holies. This is taken from my favorite overall depiction of the temple, I would say, again, from that Messages of Christ YouTube channel, which is a Mormon Latter-day Saint YouTube channel, but there's no doubt that they have not brought in any kind of extraneous Book of Mormon detail, at least none that contradicts the 1 Kings 6 account. The measurements here are all very, very good in general. The cherubim seem a bit short in the Holy of Holies. Remember, the Holy of Holies should be 30 feet. It's a 30-foot cube in essence, and the cherubim are 15 feet high, and they take up half of that. So these cherubim are too short, but excellent depiction of the sea. You can see there the bronze oxen, 3 facing in any given direction. The sea is 15 feet in circumference. The altar there, we know from the chronicler, is 30 feet across, 15 feet high. I really like the depiction of the vestibule, the bronze pillars. Caleb, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree. This is probably my favorite overall depiction, even if we might disagree, or there might be some details. I would say I think the Holy Holies is a little too large, maybe a little too tall.
Right.
I think it's supposed to drop down from the inside of the main vestibule. But other than that, I also like the bronze lavers that they have outside on the wheels. Kind of chariot looking, which I think is probably about right. Of course, the bronze sea. I like that it shows the scale of the sea and the altar in relation to the temple, and shows you how massive those particularly distinctive elements are, and the bronze columns. It kind of gives you a picture of what would have stood out to the person approaching the temple.
That is a good view of both of them. One way, Caleb, I think they could have made the Holy of Holies a bit better is by elevating it and then making the staircase a bit higher.
Yeah.
I imagine they were kind of hesitant to do that, and because it would have taken up more space in the nave, and that's why we have this taller Holy of Holies. This is from the same depiction of the nave, and we can't quite tell whether the door has leaves or not, but otherwise I really have no complaints here. This is a really excellent depiction. We have the cherubim, the palm leaves, the lampstands lining the nave. The nave looks like it's about 30 feet across. I would note that the ceiling is not right above the door. So if you think about the fact that the room seems to go up a bit higher, then it looks like it is probably about 45 feet tall. I think all of the details here have been done really perfectly.
My only question is, are those Mandela-looking things supposed to be the pomegranates? Those circles?
Below the cherubim.
Yeah. I mean, because when I looked at this, I thought it's missing the pomegranates. But I thought maybe those star Mandela-looking things are supposed to be, which I think is a bit stylized, not necessarily wrong. I guess that's just what their depiction is. That does look a little more modern Eastern than I would expect the pomegranates to be a bit more literal and two-dimensional in their depiction rather than stylized and geometric. But other than that,
and of course we have to make some inferences about what some of the stylistic details.
Absolutely, yeah.
This is another rougher depiction, just trying to convey the general idea, I think. But I like that here you can see the presence of God that came to dwell in the temple immediately after the temple was dedicated. Remember, this was not something that was perpetual. The energy of this manifestation of God's presence was not continually there because the priests could not even go into the temple to minister when it was present in the Holy of Holies. So this isn't something that would have perpetually propelled people away from the temple. But lamps lining the sides looks like about the right width, and we have the palm leaves and the cherubim on the walls.
I don't have any other comment than I don't think it's as good as the previous image, but You're right for what it's trying to represent.
Now this is, I thought we'd just briefly look at Solomon's reception hall in his palace. This is we didn't talk about the palace at all, we just didn't have enough time, but the palace is right by the temple. We're told that this hall was called the Forest because it had so many great pillars. I think this is an accurate depiction of its size. This is a famous painting by Edward Poynter. Depicts Solomon receiving the Queen of Sheba. And we can see here the lions on Solomon's throne. That's an accurate detail from the biblical account. And also we're told Solomon was collecting all these grand animals, including peacocks. And that's why you can see some peacocks there to the right of his throne.
Right, we didn't get into this, but again, the overall stylistic elements of this, except for maybe the iconic, or is that Dorian or iconic columns?
Oh, the columns there by the throne.
That's a little outside of the architectural time frame. That'd be more 4th to 5th century BC Greece, but and Ionia. But other than that, I don't have any complaints here either.
What do you think about the primary support columns? I mean, we know this room was full of these massive columns, and that's why it was thought of as a forest.
Right. So the capitals, of course, those aren't as stylized in the Greek as the ones for his throne.
I see what you're saying. All right, now let's look at some depictions of the temple that I think don't over-exaggerate, but in fact are far too modest. This, believe it or not, I found on a church's website. This is apparently supposed to be the nave leading into the Holy of Holies. And here, I think what's going on is the artist has imported this idea that, of course, the biblical account has exaggerated everything and is describing a building that simply wasn't plausible at the time. And that's why we have basically a little shack here. I think we need to bear in mind here that, remember, we will look, by the way, briefly at Abu Simbel, which is a temple of similar dimensions that was built 200 years earlier in Egypt. This is 1,500 years after the pyramids were built. I have no doubt that these kinds of minimalists who are skeptical of the description of the temple, if we had preserved a description of the pyramids, there is no way they would accept the description of the pyramids as something that had actually existed. And this is well over 1,000 years later that the temple was built. It is not that hard to believe, Caleb. This is a reasonably sized building for a monarchy at the time. I don't think there's any reason to assume that actually was a grotesque exaggeration and we should be thinking of some kind of wooden shack.
Yeah, I think this comes from the same tradition that wants to minimize the political extent of the Kingdom of Israel as well at the same time. So if you're going to minimize it to basically a city-state that surrounds Jerusalem and doesn't have access to much resources or maybe much manpower, then of course you have to downsize the temple at the same time. Again, I think this kind of goes far even in that tradition, because even a wealthy city-state at the time, which, I mean, if you want to say that you can't contend that at this time we could have from external records that there was a time of peace and plenty in the region because of the dearth of a expansionistic power, either from Egypt or from Assyria or from Babylon. So even then, a small city-state that was in a time of plenty could build something more impressive than this. This is something that a couple craftsmen and a couple months could slap together.
Yeah.
And we have this recording of these massive expenses that were piled up, or these massive resources that were piled up from the time of David. And that, so it's a plausible account in Kings that the significant resources of the kingdom were dedicated to building this temple. That's not what this looks like at all.
Now, all right, what's going on here? This is, I'm sorry to say, a traditional Masonic depiction of the temple. Freemasons use, and we'll look at another one of these kind of wedding cake type towers to depict Solomon's temple because, and we discuss this in detail in our podcast, there is a data point in the books of Chronicles that says the vestibule was 180 feet high, 120 cubits high. No other mention of this anywhere. Not by any of the eyewitnesses to the temple, that there was this towering skyscraper vestibule. The author of the books of Kings never mentions anything like this, which he certainly would have had it existed. And as I mentioned in the podcast episode, even the future eschatological temple of Ezekiel does not have any structure that is this high, even though it's quite impressive. So what's happened here is the Freemasons who created this model resorted to a wedding cake tower, which there's no mention of in the text, in order to explain the 180-foot vestibule. This was clearly a scrivener's error, and this really underscores the erroneous nature of that single data point in the books of Chronicles. However the error came about, I think we can have no doubt there was not a 180-foot vestibule.
Right. I mean, if you look at this is why I like looking at these images, because when you're just reading it, it kind of, you can kind of glaze over it. This kind of heightens the sense of absurdity that figure actually generates when you see it rendered in a three-dimensional, two-dimensional depiction like this. Now, of the various Masonic designs that incorporate this particular dimension, I like this one the best. I think it's the most, aesthetically pleasing. It looks the least ridiculous. However ridiculous it looks. I also like the little detail of the cherub, 4 cherubs at the top of the tower.
That is nice.
It's a nice little touch. Completely not in the text at all, but it is nice. I also noticed it's missing the sea.
Oh, I don't see the sea out there. Yeah. Right. This does underscore, as you said, had there been this kind of 180-foot vestibule, this would have been the main feature of the temple. And every time other eyewitnesses, we mentioned Ezekiel was an eyewitness to the temple, referred to or alluded to the temple, we would expect this to come up, the fact that it was a skyscraper. When the second temple was being rebuilt, we would have expected people to say, why aren't you building a skyscraper like the first temple? There's no way that this is accurate. Here's another example of this, not as aesthetically pleasing. You mentioned there are ways to make it aesthetically pleasing and ways to make it not so pleasing. And here, it is just utterly ridiculous. They've tried to make it architecturally plausible. It's not a straight shot. And again, there's no mention of any kind of sloping or tapered structure in the text. But you can see here the vestibule would be more than twice as tall as the actual entire length of the temple.
I also noticed they kind of made the pyramid steps up to the altar at least a little bit broader than I read in the text. That also is looking a little more pyramidal shape. And then I'm wondering what they thought the big bronze thing on top of the tower was supposed to be. It looks like another C almost.
Some flourish, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you compare their C to their altar, it seems like they took the data point 30 feet across for the altar as referring to this bottom tier
part,
of the altar.
Yeah.
Now, this is a nice midway point. Here we have a pretty tall vestibule, which there's no mention of in the king's text, but I assume what's going on here is the artist thought, all right, well, we have this error that was at least passed along in this manuscript of the chronicler of a super tall vestibule, so that must have come from somewhere, or it wouldn't have been passed along. So maybe there was a rather tall vestibule that was somewhat higher than the rest of the temple. I think that's reasonably plausible, and this is a nice looking design that in most other respects is faithful to the text. The C is a bit too small, but I generally like the length and the width of the temple here.
Sure, and if you want to make a compromise, I think that's probably the way to do it. It's a bit of an arbitrary point. I think they just were trying to make the vestibule taller than the rest of it. And you notice in order to keep the proportion and kind of the aesthetics in line, they made it, a quarter again as tall or something along those lines, which is, again, way outside of the bounds of this 180 cubit, 180 foot, I should say.
Right, 120 cubits.
120 cubit measurement.
What I thought we'd do here is some comparisons with other ancient Near Eastern art from the same time period. We have almost no surviving examples of carved wood from the ancient Near East. And here we have an example from the throne of Tutmosis IV from the 18th dynasty. So this is centuries before the first temple was built, but we can imagine what the decorations inside the nave might have looked like. The decorations inside the nave were, as you can see here on the right, carved wood overlaid with gold. This is an example of a wood carving from the throne of a pharaoh from centuries prior to the first temple.
And notice the similarity between the creatures. I mean, I think the Egyptologists referred to the creature on the left as a sphinx instead of a cherub. Now, this could be just an interpolation between cultural differences, or it could be a completely different creature. We don't know.
But you do
but
have...
there's a stylistic similarity there.
Right, and people who study ancient
possible.
Babylon, ancient Assyria, will use the term cherub to refer to similar quadruped creatures from those civilizations. And here we have, I mentioned earlier that the temple at Abu Simbel is a good reference point. Those statues on the left, again, this was a couple of centuries prior to the construction of the first temple. Those are 33 feet tall. The temple itself, the interior of the nave, is 45 feet tall. We can get a sense of roughly the scale of the first temple by thinking about the temple at Abu Simbel, which still exists today. So I think this just underscores for me no reason to assume that all of these dimensions are exaggerations. This was well within architectural possibility for the time period.
Sure. To play devil's advocate, I'm sure the skeptics would say, and the minimalists would say that obviously ancient Egypt had far more resources and manpower at its beck and call than ancient Israel did, which I think is begging the question to a certain extent. If you take the king's account as first value, it's saying that because of the extent of David's conquests and the nature of the peace that Solomon brought about in his wise governorship, he had, at least for a short period of time, similar access to extensive resources. And so if you assume that, and then you can look at Abu Simbel and say that architecturally this is a plausible design, this is a plausible scale, I don't see any reason for these kind of extreme minimalism that we're seeing.
I would also say the temple in the first king's account is less sophisticated in some ways than Abu Simbel. We don't have these solid carved statues from stone. We have wood statues overlaid with gold, which would have been much more affordable, much less effort intensive than carving these massive colossi.
I would say probably skill and sort of technological possibility-wise, the hardest thing are probably the C and the bronze columns.
Right, which is why bronze workers were brought in from out
exactly.
of the kingdom.
And the account specifically says that they outsourced to experts, a civilization that was well known and well versed in those technologies.
All right, Caleb, now I thought we'd briefly look at a few videos depicting the temple. This is the video version of that Messages of Christ LDS video I mentioned earlier. We agreed this was an excellent depiction of the sea. Note that they add a kind of foundation behind the bronze bowls. And one reason we should be skeptical that there was any such foundation is that much later in the books of Kings, when the sea is removed from the bowls, it's simply set on the ground. So I think probably it was sitting directly on the bowls.
Right. That might have been just a interpolation of the weight that they think would have been involved and the lack of ability of the bowls to support it. But you can make other assumptions there. Again,
good depiction of the 3 floors. As you saw a moment ago, this YouTube channel, Messages of Christ, they also do an excellent job depicting priestly garments in incredible biblical detail.
I find it interesting that they just have the gold overlay on the carvings themselves, not over the entire door.
All right, now this is what happens when you take the data point from the chronicler and you don't even try to create an architecturally plausible structure like a wedding cake design. So this video has simply created, basically punched in zeros into this building simulator and created this massive towering obelisk that just absolutely dominates the landscape.
I think it's heightening the absurdity of the figure. I find that ramp also interesting, and the fact that
it is interesting. Yeah. Yeah, rather than steps up to the altar, which would have been the traditional design.
Those columns, Jacques and Boaz, also look rather thick.
This is a good depiction of the sea, I would say. And here we have an example of the sea sitting directly on the backs of the bronze oxen, which I think is accurate.
And it's three each lined in a cardinal direction, so it's sets of 3 as opposed to the other depictions we've seen, which is 12, sort of on an equidistant angle from each other.
Yeah, you're right. Those are quite tremendously thick. Yeah, that does seem hard to fathom.
The folding doors.
The folding doors are good. That's correct. And here we have, this is, I think, what most people are thinking of when they hear the word cherubim. Is it possible the cherubim looked like that? Yes. Is there any reason to assume that's what the cherubim looked like? No, I don't think so. And let's look at one last video. This is a simulation depicting Solomon's dedication of the temple. I like a lot of the dimensions here. The altar looks about the right size, especially relative to the sea. And this is a depiction of the glory of God entering the temple. We're told it looked like a cloud. So I like this depiction of it. Of course, we don't know whether it was a continuous stream of this kind, but this does emphasize the extent to which it was a public, spectacular event. The glory of God filled the temple in a way that was felt and was visible, so I think that is an honest rendition of the text. Well, I would say in conclusion that there are 2 groups of people that are very interested in making depictions of the temple, Freemasons and Mormons. Mormons seem to be the better of the 2. They take the data of 1 Kings chapter 6 very seriously and also are interested in comparing the temple to other ancient Near Eastern architecture and imagery. And we know for a fact that ancient Near Eastern imagery would have influenced the construction of the temple because it was built in a Phoenician rectangular design with the assistance of Phoenicians and even with foreign bronze work. So those depictions, I think, are plausible. The Masonic designs that have this wedding cake tower inspired by the chronicler, not so much. And next time on Books of Kings, we're going to be talking about the rise of Jeroboam, the decline of Solomon, his rebuke by God, and then the beginning of the division of the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah into 2 kingdoms.